discussions with Christians, the believer will very often quote the Bible, but I find this to be one of the worst defenses of their position, because the Bible is simply unreliable. And we can argue about the immorality in the biblical text until the earth is vaporized, but the faithful will always shift the goalposts with arguments about interpretation, parable, metaphor, it was a different time, blah blah blah. Now, personally, I have no use for any of that. So setting aside whatever we might think the text means, we first need to acknowledge that we cannot even be sure what it says. Let's consider some very salient facts about that so-called holy book. The Bible is a collection of some 66 different books or letters written by different authors over the span of many centuries in several different languages. We have no originals of any biblical manuscripts. Let me repeat that. We have no originals of any biblical manuscripts. What we have is copies of copies of copies written in most cases centuries after the original books, with each successive copyist not only making his own mistakes, but also reproducing the errors of the many scribes before him. Many of the oldest manuscripts we have are just mere fragments, not full books. For instance, the oldest and most famous New Testament manuscript is called P52. It contains some passages from the Gospel of John, but is only about the size of a credit card. We don't see full transcripts of the New Testament until about the 4th century. And when these 5,700 or so manuscripts are compared, we find hundreds of thousands of errors, from simple misspellings to apparently deliberate changes, omissions, or inclusions of entirely new passages. As Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, says, "Why should one think that God performed the miracle of inspiring the words if he didn't perform the miracle of preserving the words?" Everyone knows the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, John 8, 1-11, wherein he famously said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." But few are aware that this iconic biblical tale is not in the oldest and best manuscripts. It was added by later scribes. The earliest copy of the Gospel of John to include this story is part of a 5th century manuscript. Another example is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. The most reliable early manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end at chapter 16, verse 8, but later scribes apparently added 12 more verses. Amusingly, these are the very verses that talk about handling serpents and drinking deadly poisons, which the Appalachian snake handling cults cite in their crazy rituals. In some manuscripts, the author of Hebrews 2:9 says, "Christ died by the grace of God," but other manuscripts say he died apart from God. Now, this discrepancy presents a very big difference in terms of doctrine. All modern English translations choose to use some variation of the grace manuscripts, presumably to avoid the implications of the other wording. So, if Christian translators are making ideological determinations of which manuscript text to use and which to ignore, we have no reason to think that the early Christian scribes would have done any different. Modern biblical historians generally agree that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which were historically attributed to the authorship of Moses, could not have been written by Moses, for a couple of reasons. First, he would have had to have written about his own death, which seems rather unlikely. And secondly, many modern historians agree that the Moses character never actually existed, but is most likely a mythical archetype. A good read, if you're interested, is a book titled "Did Moses Exist?" by D.M. Murdoch. Biblical historians also agree that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses, and certainly not by Jesus' illiterate Aramaic-speaking disciples. They were written by highly educated Greek-speaking authors. The earliest Gospel manuscripts have no autographs. The names associated with those books were just titles added by later scribes. It's also widely acknowledged that Matthew and Luke were largely plagiarized from Mark, the oldest of the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, much of the Matthew and Luke accounts are copied verbatim from Mark. Scholars also agree that the Gospels were written at least several decades after the supposed events. The earliest was around 65 AD. That's 3 decades after the purported death of Jesus. And that's plenty of time for legendary embellishment to be incorporated. And don't be fooled by the argument that such embellishment would have been corrected by contemporary critics. These texts were distributed among and jealously safeguarded by the early Christian sects. And furthermore, in the centuries after Constantine declared Christianity the official Roman religion, a whole lot of book burning took place. So it's reasonable to assume that if there were any such critical writings, they would have been deemed heresy and destroyed. The Gospel of John was written in a very different style from the 3 synoptic Gospels and is dated around the end of the 1st century AD. Most historians agree that it could not have been written by the Apostle John, or any of the other apostles for that matter. The majority think it was instead written by a Johannine community, which traced its traditions to John. The Acts of the Apostles was written sometime in the 2nd century, and most scholars agree that it is almost certainly historical fiction. It's widely believed that the book of Acts contains allusions to the stories of Homer and Virgil, as well as many markers indicative of ancient fiction. Nearly all biblical historians acknowledge that 1st and 2nd Peter were not written by the same author, and that these, as well as several other letters in the New Testament, are forgeries. I could go on and on with examples of scribal errors, suspected forgery, deliberate textual changes, and I didn't even touch on the contradictions in the Bible, but I think I've provided sufficient reason to doubt the reliability of the biblical text. I encourage everyone to do their own research on all of these points, many of which come directly from Christian sources. But if, having done that, you still think that error-filled copies of copies written by partisan zealots centuries after the fact is nonetheless inerrant,
Error.